Here is question 4 from the IB1 Quadratics test. I'm breaking it up into one video for parts A and B and then another video for parts C and D. So these are very straightforward questions. It's not even really, truly quadratic work. You've done this long before you knew much about quadratic functions. It's just factoring practice. So hopefully we're pretty good at this, but I'll go through it quickly. First thing we want to notice in both of these, we'll start with A, but in both of them, the coefficient on the x squared term is 1. So there's nothing written there. It's assumed there's a 1 there. We just don't write it. But that means it's basically the easiest type of factoring question. So all we need to do is we need to look at the back number. And we know we want two numbers that multiply to that back number. So it's going to our two numbers have to multiply to -7 and add to the middle number, which are -6, which is -6. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to -7, add to -6. This should be pretty easy because there's only two numbers that multiply to 7, and that's 7 and 1. So my numbers are -7 and +1. Again, I know that because they add to -6. Okay, so then we just set up our two brackets. Again, this is an easy one because the first term is x squared, so each bracket is just going to start with a single x, and then you input the numbers that we solve for. And that's exactly factored. You can always check if your factoring is correct by foiling this back out. So you could multiply it back out and you would get right back to where the original question was. Okay, so that's factored form. Let's do the same for part B. I'll do the part B solution in blue. Same thing. Coefficient is 1 in front, so we just look at the back number we need to multiply to, which is -21. We look at the middle number, which is what our two numbers have to add to, and that is +4. With a little bit of mental math, we should see that these numbers are 7 and -3. Right, those multiply to -21, add to 4. So same thing, two brackets. Because our coefficient is 1, each bracket is going to start with an x. Input the numbers +7 -3. Now the only difference here is that we are equal to 0 and it said solve. Whenever it says solve, you're actually looking for an answer for the x values. In part A, we just had to factor, essentially rearranging the equation. In part B, we had to factor in order to solve. And the reason for that is if you look at the equation as given, it's very difficult to determine what x might be to make this left side equal to 0. However, now in factored form, we have one bracket multiplied by another bracket to give 0. Right, so we've turned from addition and subtraction into multiplication here in the middle. So if we're multiplying two things together to give 0, we know that one of them must be 0. So in other words, either this bracket has to be 0 or this bracket has to be 0 if these things are going to multiply to give 0. So we just quickly, if you can't see it straight off the bat, you can set each bracket to 0, but it's pretty straightforward to see. Here x needs to be -7 in order to make this bracket 0, and here x needs to be +3 because 3 minus 3 would be 0. So these are our two solutions, x equals -7 or x equals 3. We can put a little or in there. So those are your two solutions. So don't forget, if it may just say factor, in that case just factor and you're done, but if it says solve, we actually need answers for x values. Again, showing why factored form is important in finding things like x-intercepts because we set that equation equal to 0. Hopefully this is easy. Part C and D coming up.